welcome. You've reached a place where history unfolds slowly, one quiet story at a time. So settle into a comfortable position, dim the lights if you haven't already, and let the distractions of today fade gently into the background. There's nowhere you need to be, and nothing you need to do except listen. Together, we'll wander through forgotten civilizations, remarkable journeys, and the everyday lives of people who came long before us. Take a slow, comfortable breath, relax, and let the past gently carry you toward sleep. If this kind of slow, quiet history is something you enjoy, you're welcome to subscribe, so that future stories like this one can find you when you need them on some other tired evening. Tonight, our journey begins in the desert, not the desert of postcards, all rolling dunes and silence, but a wider, more complicated place. A stretch of land reaching from the eastern edge of the Roman province of Syria, down through what is now Jordan, and into the wide, dry heart of the Arabian Peninsula. In the 4th century after Christ, this was a borderland, a place where two very different worlds leaned against each other. On one side, the immense and ancient machinery of the Roman Empire, with its roads and its legions and its emperors seated far away in Constantinople or Antioch. On the other, the older, freer world of the Arab tribes, who had lived among these sands for longer than Rome had existed at all. It is here, in this quiet and often overlooked corner of history, that our story unfolds. It is the story of a woman named Mavia. Some ancient writers spelled her name Mawia in the Arabic style, and others rendered it in Greek or Latin letters as Mavia or Mania. The exact spelling was never fixed, because the people who eventually wrote her story down were not her own people. They were Roman and Greek historians, writing from the outside, trying to make sense of a woman whose power seemed, to them, faintly impossible to explain. For a brief window of years, roughly between 375 and 378 AD, Queen Mavia did something that almost no other regional ruler in the entire history of the Roman Empire had managed to do. She led her people into open war against Rome, and she won, not once, but across a series of campaigns in the deserts and border towns of Phoenicia, Palestine, and the edges of Egypt. Roman commanders who marched out to put down what they assumed would be a minor uprising found themselves outmaneuvered again and again by an enemy who understood the desert in ways they never could. And then, rather than pressing her advantage into ruin, she made peace on her own terms, terms that Rome, remarkably, accepted. It is a story that deserves to be better known. And yet, for many centuries, it sat quietly in the margins of history books, mentioned only in passing by a handful of church historians who were more interested in a bishop she helped install than in the queen herself. Tonight, we will walk through her world slowly, the way one might walk across sand in the cool of the evening, taking our time, feeling how the ground shifts slightly beneath each step. To understand Mavia, we first need to understand the world she was born into. A world balanced, quite literally, on a fault line between empires. By the middle of the 4th century, the Roman Empire had existed for well over 300 years. It was no longer the compact republic that had once ruled only the Italian peninsula. It now stretched from the misty hills of Britain in the northwest, across the whole of continental Europe, around the entire rim of the Mediterranean Sea, and deep into the Near East. It had recently been divided, in practical terms, into an eastern and a western half, each with its own emperor, though in theory they still governed a single empire together. The eastern half is the one that concerns us. Its great cities were places we still recognize by name today, even if their old glory has faded. Antioch, in what is now southern Turkey, was one of the largest and wealthiest cities in the ancient world, a place of columned streets and bustling markets, where goods from Persia, India, and the Arabian interior all passed through on their way to Roman tables. Further south lay Damascus, and Bostra, and Jerusalem, all cities that had been absorbed into the Roman provincial system generations earlier. Their local rulers replaced, over time, by Roman governors. But empire, especially an empire this large, has edges. And edges are rarely tidy. To the east and south of these Roman cities lay a vast, dry expanse that Roman administrators simply called Arabia, though it was never one single place and never one single people. It stretched from the Fertile Crescent in the north, down through what modern maps call the Syrian desert, the Jordanian desert, and eventually into the true, deep interior of the Arabian Peninsula, a region so vast and so difficult to cross that even Rome, with all its ambition, had never fully conquered it. Instead, Rome had learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, to work with the desert rather than against it. Because the tribes who lived along this frontier were not simple, isolated wanderers. They were sophisticated pastoral and trading peoples who moved with the seasons, following grazing land for their herds of camels, sheep, and goats, and who also controlled something Rome desperately needed: the caravan routes. These routes were the arteries of ancient global trade. Frankincense and myrrh from southern Arabia, silk that had traveled unimaginable distances from China, spices from India carried up through the Red Sea ports. All of it eventually had to cross Arab-controlled desert territory before it could reach Roman markets. A tribe that controlled a well, or a mountain pass, or a stretch of caravan road held real power, whether or not it wore the trappings of a formal kingdom. Among the many tribal groups along this frontier, one confederation rose to particular prominence in the middle of the 4th century. They were known as the Tanukhids. The Tanukhids were not a single tribe in the narrow sense, but a broad alliance of Arab clans who had, over the preceding century, organized themselves into something more like a loose kingdom, or what modern historians sometimes call a tribal confederation. Their territory shifted with circumstance, but at their height, they controlled land stretching from parts of what is now Jordan and southern Syria down toward the edges of the Arabian interior. They were pastoral people at their core, herding camels and small livestock across the seasonal grazing lands. But they also settled, in places, into semi-permanent encampments, and they engaged deeply in the caravan trade that passed through their territory. Rome, recognizing that it could not simply erase such a group, had instead entered into a familiar kind of arrangement. The Tanukhids became what Rome called foederati, an old Latin term meaning federated allies. In exchange for peace along the frontier, and often military support when Rome needed it, allied tribes like the Tanukhids were left largely free to govern their own internal affairs under their own chosen leaders. It was not equality between two great powers. Rome still saw itself as the dominant partner, granting favor rather than negotiating between equals. But it was, in practice, a relationship that gave desert kingdoms like the Tanukhid confederation a genuine degree of independence, so long as they did not challenge Roman authority too openly. For a while, this arrangement held. The Tanukhids were led during this period by a king whose name has come down to us in different forms in different ancient sources, and it was this king whom Mavia married. Ancient writers tell us frustratingly little about her early life. We do not know precisely when or where she was born, or the details of her family before her marriage. This absence is not unusual for women in ancient historical records, even queens, whose lives were often only recorded once they intersected directly with events that male chroniclers considered significant, such as wars, treaties, or the affairs of the church. What we do know is this. At some point in the early 370s, her husband, the Tanukhid king, died. And rather than the confederation dissolving or being absorbed quietly by a neighboring power, or passing to a male relative as might have been expected, Mavia stepped into the position of leadership herself. This detail alone tells us something important, even in the silence of the sources. For a woman to assume the leadership of a powerful desert confederation in a world where military command was almost universally the province of men, there must have already existed within Tanukhid society some acceptance of female authority, or at the very least, a recognition that Mavia herself possessed the particular combination of political skill and personal standing needed to hold such a fractious alliance of tribes together, because holding a confederation like this together was never simple. Unlike a centralized kingdom with a single capital and a standing bureaucracy, a tribal confederation depended on the ongoing consent and loyalty of many smaller groups, each with its own leaders, its own herds, its own sense of honor and grievance. A queen who could not command respect, who could not settle disputes fairly, who could not lead in battle when battle came, would not have lasted. Mavia, it seems, could do all of these things, and soon she would need to. Let us rest here for a moment in this quiet borderland before the story moves forward. Picture the world as it was in those years. Long caravan lines moving slowly across pale, sun-baked earth, the soft sound of camel bells carrying across still air. Encampments of dark woven tents, clustered near a well or a stand of palms, smoke rising thin and straight in the evening light. Somewhere to the north and west, the stone cities of Rome, with their marble columns and their busy harbors, going about their own great and complicated business, mostly unaware of the quiet, capable woman who now led the desert peoples along their southern frontier. Two worlds, close enough to trade with one another, close enough to marry into one another's ruling families, and yet fundamentally different in how they understood power, land, and freedom. It is in the space between these two worlds that Mavia's story will unfold. And in our next segment, we will look more closely at the tensions that were quietly building along that frontier. Tensions that would soon turn a peaceful, uneasy border into a battlefield. For now, simply rest with the image of that wide, starlit desert, and let your breathing slow to match its stillness. In the years following her husband's death, Mavia did not simply inherit power the way a title might pass quietly from one generation to the next in a settled kingdom. Desert confederations did not work quite that way. Leadership among the Tanukhids and among most of the Arab tribal groups of this period was something closer to a position that had to be actively held through ongoing consent, through demonstrated capability, and through the kind of personal authority that could not simply be handed down on paper. We should picture, then, not a coronation in the way we might imagine one in a Roman or European court, with crowns and ceremonies inside a great stone hall, but something more gradual and more organic. A widow already respected within her husband's confederation, who continued to be consulted, continued to be looked to for guidance, and who slowly, through the accumulation of trust and practical decisions, became recognized by the assembled clans as their leader in full. It is worth remembering that in many pastoral societies of this era, women often held significant informal authority within the household and the camp, managing resources, mediating disputes, and maintaining the social bonds that held a mobile community together. Mavia's rise to formal leadership may have been less an anomaly than it first appears to us, viewing it from many centuries later through the lens of societies that developed very different assumptions about who could rule. Still, it was unusual enough that when Roman and Greek writers eventually recorded her story, they treated her leadership itself as a notable fact, worth commenting on, rather than something to be passed over without remark. The Roman world, by contrast, was one where female rule, while not entirely unheard of, was rare and almost always came wrapped in controversy or explained away as a temporary arrangement until a suitable male heir could take over. Mavia offered no such reassurance to Roman observers. She ruled, plainly, as queen. To understand what kind of queen she was, it helps to understand a little more about daily life along this frontier in the 4th century, because it shaped everything about how she would eventually wage and win a war against the most powerful military machine of the ancient world. Life among the Tanukhid confederation followed the old rhythms of pastoral movement. Through the cooler months, herds of camels, sheep, and goats would graze on whatever vegetation the winter rains had coaxed from the ground, moving across wide stretches of steppe and desert margin. As the dry season deepened, families and their animals would draw closer to reliable water sources, to wells, and to the edges of settled agricultural land near the Roman-controlled towns. This was not a wandering without purpose. It was a carefully learned, generations deep knowledge of where water could be found, where grazing would last longest, and how to read the sky and the soil for the earliest signs of seasonal change. This same knowledge, the knowledge of water, of distance, of how far an animal or person could travel in a day without breaking down, would later prove to be one of Mavia's greatest advantages in the conflict to come. Roman armies, for all their discipline and their engineering skill, were built to fight in a particular way. They favored open, decisive battles between organized infantry lines, supported by fortified camps, well-maintained supply roads, and predictable logistics. They were extraordinarily effective in the kind of warfare they had spent centuries perfecting. But the desert did not offer that kind of battlefield. In the desert, water itself was a weapon. An army that did not know which wells held water in a given season, or how quickly a raiding party could vanish into open country and reappear somewhere else entirely, was an army working at a profound disadvantage. No matter how well drilled its soldiers were on a parade ground back in Antioch, Mavia's people, by contrast, had spent their entire lives reading this landscape. They understood which routes allowed rapid movement and which would exhaust an unfamiliar force. They knew where a small, mobile group of riders could strike at a Roman supply column and disappear again before a response could be organized. This was not a matter of superior weaponry or greater numbers. In almost every recorded engagement of this period, the Tanukhid forces under Mavia's command were smaller than the Roman forces sent against them. Their advantage lay elsewhere, in mobility, in local knowledge, and, we should say plainly, in leadership. It is worth pausing here to consider what kind of person could hold this kind of confederation together well enough to wage a sustained, multi-year campaign against Rome. A queen who ruled poorly, who could not settle the inevitable disputes between clans over grazing rights or leadership disagreements, would have seen her coalition fracture the moment real pressure was applied. War tends to reveal weakness in alliances quickly, and yet Mavia's confederation held, campaign after campaign, suggesting a ruler who commanded not just formal obedience, but genuine loyalty. We do not have Mavia's own words. No letters, no personal accounts, nothing written from her own perspective has survived. If such things were ever written down at all, in a largely oral desert culture. Everything we know about her comes filtered through the eyes of Roman and Greek Christian historians, writing sometimes years or decades after the events they describe, and writing always from the perspective of the empire she opposed. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it shapes everything about how her story has come down to us. We are hearing about a desert queen almost entirely through the words of the very civilization she defeated. And yet, even filtered through that lens, even softened or reshaped by writers who had their own reasons for telling the story the way they did, something of Mavia's genuine capability still shines through. The historian Socrates Scholasticus, writing his ecclesiastical history in the following century, described her in the sparse way ancient historians often described military leaders, primarily through the results of her actions rather than through personal detail. Rufinus, another early church historian, gives us a similarly brief but respectful account, one that treats her military successes as simply factual, without the kind of dismissive tone that might have been expected toward a female ruler from a culture that Roman writers often viewed as peripheral or lesser. What emerges, even from these fragments, is the picture of a ruler who was taken seriously by her contemporaries, however reluctantly, because the results of her leadership could not be argued away. Now, before we move into the causes of the conflict itself, let us slow down again and simply picture this world a little longer. The Roman frontier in the 4th century was not a hard line drawn across a map, the way modern borders often are. It was a wide, breathing zone of contact, where Roman soldiers stationed in desert forts traded with Arab herders, where Arab caravan leaders negotiated tolls, and safe passage with Roman provincial officials, where marriages and disputes and long friendships all crossed back and forth across whatever boundary existed on paper. Mavia herself would have known this Roman world reasonably well, not as a distant, mythical enemy, but as a familiar neighboring power, with its garrisons and its governors, and its endless appetite for tribute and cooperation. She would have understood Roman military organization, at least in broad strokes, simply through years of proximity and interaction. This familiarity, this lack of mystery about who and what she was eventually going to face, may well have been part of what allowed her to make the calculated decision to go to war in the first place. She was not stepping blindly into conflict with an unknown power. She understood, likely quite clearly, both the strengths and the very real limitations of the empire she was about to challenge. In our next segment, we will look at what finally pushed this uneasy, long-standing peace into open war. It involves questions of religion, of imperial politics far away in Constantinople, and of a growing sense among the Tanukhid confederation that the old arrangement with Rome could no longer be trusted to hold. For now, let the picture rest. A wide frontier at dusk, cook fires beginning to glow across a darkening plain. A queen, still relatively new to her full authority, watching the horizon and beginning, perhaps, to sense that the peace she had inherited was not going to last much longer. Let us move a little further into the story now, following the slow build toward conflict, to understand why war eventually broke out between Mavia's confederation and the Roman Empire. We need to widen our view for a moment, away from the desert itself, and toward the city of Constantinople, where an emperor named Valens sat on the Eastern Roman throne. Valens had come to power in 364 AD, ruling the eastern half of the empire, while his brother Valentinian ruled the west. He inherited an empire that was, in many ways, still recovering from decades of internal instability, civil wars between rival claimants to the throne, and the slow, grinding pressure of various peoples along its northern and eastern frontiers, all of whom were, in one way or another, testing the limits of Roman strength. One of the defining features of Valens's reign was his religious policy. This may seem, at first, like a strange thing to bring into a story about desert warfare. But in the 4th century, questions of Christian theology were deeply entangled with questions of imperial politics in ways that can be difficult for us to fully appreciate today. The Roman Empire, only a few decades earlier under Emperor Constantine, had begun its long transition from persecuting Christianity to officially embracing it. But Christianity itself, in this period, was far from unified. A significant theological dispute divided the Church, centered on the nature of Christ and his relationship to God the Father. On one side stood what would eventually become the dominant Orthodox position, associated with the Council of Nicaea. On the other stood a set of beliefs broadly grouped under the label Arianism, named after an earlier theologian, Arius, who had proposed a different understanding of Christ's divine nature. Valens himself favored the Arian position, and as emperor, he did not merely hold this view privately. He actively promoted it, sometimes forcefully, appointing Arian bishops to important sees, and at times pressuring or removing bishops who held the opposing Nicene view. Now, here is where this theological dispute intersects directly with our story. Mavia and her Tanukhid confederation were, by this period, Christian. Arab Christianity along the Roman frontier had been growing for generations, spread through trade contact, through intermarriage, and through the gradual cultural exchange that always occurs along a long-standing border. And the Christianity practiced by Mavia's people appears to have aligned with the Nicene position, the same position that Valens was actively working against within his own empire. When Mavia rose to full leadership of the Tanukhid confederation, one of her early and significant acts, according to the ancient historians who recorded these events, was to request that a particular holy man, a hermit and ascetic named Moses, be consecrated as bishop for her people. Moses was known, even among Roman Christians, for his piety and his reputation for living a simple, devoted religious life in the desert. But he was firmly Nicene in his theology, not Arian. This request placed Mavia in direct tension with the religious policy of the Roman emperor. Valens's officials, unsurprisingly, wanted to appoint an Arian bishop for the Tanukhid confederation, in keeping with the emperor's broader policy of promoting Arian church leadership throughout the Eastern Empire. Mavia refused to accept this. She wanted Moses, specifically, a man whose theological alignment matched her own community's beliefs, not a bishop imposed on her by an emperor she had increasing reason to distrust. It would be too simple, however, to say that this religious disagreement alone caused a war. Wars between empires and their frontier allies are rarely caused by a single grievance. Rather, this dispute over the appointment of a bishop appears to have been the visible flashpoint atop a much deeper set of tensions that had been building for some time. Chief among these deeper tensions was a simple, recurring pattern in the relationship between Rome and its allied desert tribes. The foederati arrangement, as we discussed earlier, depended on a degree of mutual respect and reliable exchange. Rome offered subsidies, trade access, and formal recognition of tribal leadership. In exchange, allied tribes offered peace along the frontier and, crucially, provided auxiliary troops when Rome needed them for its own wars elsewhere. But this arrangement only worked smoothly when both sides upheld their end of it consistently. Roman provincial administration in this period was not always consistent. Governors changed. Policies shifted with each new emperor or regional commander. Subsidies promised to allied tribes were sometimes delayed or reduced or simply not honored at all, particularly during periods when Rome's attention and resources were being pulled elsewhere, toward more urgent crises on other frontiers. And in the mid-370s, Rome's attention was very much being pulled elsewhere, along the empire's northern border, following the Danube River. A large and increasingly desperate population of Gothic peoples, themselves under pressure from the migrations of the Huns further east, were seeking permission to cross into Roman territory. This Gothic crisis would consume an enormous amount of Roman military and administrative attention throughout the later 370s, and it is likely, though not explicitly documented in every detail, that Rome's diminished attention toward its eastern desert frontier during this same period contributed to a general sense among the Tanukhid confederation that the old arrangement was fraying, that promises were not being kept with the same reliability as before. Layered on top of this practical strain was the religious dispute over Bishop Moses, which gave the growing frustration a clear, specific point of confrontation. When Mavia's request for Moses was denied or delayed by Roman authorities, insisting on an Arian appointment instead, it seems to have functioned as something of a final straw, a clear signal that Rome was not going to respect the internal autonomy that the foederati relationship was supposed to guarantee. And so, sometime around the year 375, Mavia made her decision. Rather than accepting Roman terms on the bishop, rather than continuing to operate within an alliance she increasingly viewed as unreliable and disrespectful of her people's autonomy, she chose war. It is worth pausing here to consider just how significant this decision was. This was not a minor local uprising. Mavia was choosing to lead an open military revolt against the Roman Empire, one of the most powerful and battle-tested military organizations in the ancient world. She would have known, better than almost anyone, how formidable Roman military force could be when properly mobilized. And yet she made this choice anyway, suggesting a leader who had weighed the risks carefully and who believed, based on her own understanding of desert warfare, Roman logistical limitations, and the loyalty of her own confederation, that this was a fight she could actually win. In our next segment, we will follow the war itself as it began to unfold, moving across the borderlands of Phoenicia and Palestine, as Mavia's forces met Roman troops in a series of engagements that would surprise and eventually humble some of Rome's regional commanders. For now, let us simply rest in this moment of decision. A desert queen standing at the edge of a choice that would define her legacy, weighing years of accumulated frustration against the enormous risk of open war. Let your own breathing settle, slow and even, as we prepare to follow her into that decision. We continue now, moving gently into the early days of the conflict itself, when Mavia's forces first moved against Roman positions, likely sometime around 375 or 376 AD. They did not announce their intentions with the kind of formal declaration of war that might mark a conflict between two settled kingdoms. Desert warfare, as practiced by the Tanukhid confederation, worked differently. It relied on speed, on surprise, and on a deep, almost intuitive understanding of terrain that Roman forces simply did not share. The initial campaigns unfolded across a wide arc of territory, stretching from the Roman province of Phoenicia, along what is now the coast of Lebanon, southward through Palestine, and eventually reaching, according to some ancient accounts, as far as the edges of Egypt. This was an extraordinary geographic range for a single military campaign in this period, and it tells us something important about the scale and organization of Mavia's forces. This was not a small border skirmish. It was a sustained, wide-ranging military effort, coordinated across a distance that would have required real logistical planning, even by a mobile, desert-adapted army. Let us take a moment to picture how such warfare actually looked in practice, because it differed so significantly from the kind of warfare Rome was built to fight. Roman military doctrine, refined over centuries, was built around heavy infantry, moving and fighting in disciplined formation, supported by engineering, fortification, and a remarkably efficient supply system that relied on well-maintained roads and established depots. This system worked extraordinarily well in the kind of warfare Rome most often fought against other organized states or against tribal confederations that could eventually be drawn into large, decisive battles where Roman discipline and equipment gave a significant advantage. But the Tanukhid forces under Mavia rarely offered Rome that kind of battle. Instead, their approach relied on rapid, mounted raids, striking at Roman garrisons, supply lines, and outposts, then withdrawing quickly into the open desert before a heavier Roman response could be organized. Camels and horses gave Tanukhid forces a mobility advantage that Roman infantry simply could not match across desert terrain. A raiding party might appear at dawn, strike a target, and be many miles away again by the time reinforcements arrived. This style of warfare placed enormous strain on Roman commanders, who found themselves constantly reacting rather than dictating the terms of engagement. Roman forces sent to suppress the uprising discovered that the very things that made their army so effective in conventional warfare, its heavy equipment, its reliance on established supply routes, its preference for large, organized formations, became liabilities in this kind of extended desert campaign. An army that needed regular, predictable water and supply deliveries was at a serious disadvantage against an enemy who knew the exact locations of every reliable well across hundreds of miles of open country, and who could deny access to those wells or use knowledge of them to outmaneuver pursuers entirely. The ancient historian Socrates Scholasticus tells us, in his characteristically brief style, that Mavia's forces achieved a string of victories against the Roman troops sent against them, describing her military successes as significant enough to trouble the Roman administration seriously. Rufinus, writing separately, corroborates this general picture, describing a queen whose forces proved consistently difficult for Roman commanders to defeat. We should be careful here not to overstate the scale of these engagements in the way that popular retellings sometimes do. This was not a campaign in which Mavia's forces destroyed entire Roman legions in massed, decisive battles. The way a conflict between two conventional armies might unfold. Rather, it appears to have been a sustained campaign of raids, ambushes, and localized engagements, in which Roman forces were worn down, embarrassed, and repeatedly outmaneuvered, rather than annihilated in a single dramatic confrontation. This distinction matters for historical accuracy, even as it does nothing to diminish the remarkable nature of what Mavia achieved. A sustained campaign of this kind, conducted successfully over a period of years against the full administrative and military weight of the Roman eastern frontier, required extraordinary discipline, coordination, and leadership. arguably more so than a single decisive battle would have. It is worth pausing to consider the geography involved a little more closely, since it helps explain why this style of warfare proved so effective. The regions where the fighting took place, Phoenicia, Palestine, and the desert fringe extending toward Egypt, were themselves transitional landscapes, places where settled, agricultural, Roman-administered territory gave way, sometimes quite abruptly, to open steppe and desert. Roman garrison towns in this region were often somewhat isolated outposts, connected to the broader imperial system by roads that, however well engineered, still had to cross long stretches of exposed, difficult terrain. This made them vulnerable to exactly the kind of mobile, hit-and-run warfare that Mavia's forces specialized in. There's a quiet irony worth noting here, one that speaks to the deeper relationship between Rome and its desert allies. Much of what Mavia's forces knew about Roman military organization, about garrison locations, about supply routes and patterns of movement, had likely been learned during the many years in which the Tanukhid confederation had served as loyal Roman allies. Foederati troops often fought alongside Roman forces, learned Roman tactics, and became intimately familiar with Roman logistical patterns, precisely because they had spent years operating within that system as partners rather than enemies. When that partnership broke down, the very knowledge that had made the Tanukhids useful allies to Rome became, in the hands of a capable and motivated leader like Mavia, a significant advantage against Rome itself. Ancient sources also make a point of noting that Mavia herself, and not merely appointed generals acting in her name, took an active, personal role in leading these campaigns. This detail, mentioned specifically by the historians who recorded her story, was unusual enough in the context of ancient warfare, where military command was almost universally reserved for men, that it was considered notable and worth recording even by writers who were, in every other respect, describing an enemy of their own empire. We should read this detail carefully and without exaggeration. It does not necessarily mean Mavia personally engaged in hand-to-hand combat in every skirmish. It more likely reflects that she held direct, active command authority over her forces, making strategic decisions, and at times being present with her army in the field, rather than remaining at a distance, while male generals conducted the war entirely in her name. Even this more measured understanding represents a striking departure from typical patterns of ancient female rulership, and it is one of the clearest signals we have of just how directly and personally engaged Mavia was in the conduct of this war. As the campaign continued through 376 and into 377, the pattern of Roman military struggle against Mavia's forces began to attract wider attention within the Eastern Roman administration. What had likely begun in the eyes of some Roman officials as a manageable regional disturbance, was increasingly understood as a serious and sustained challenge to Roman authority along a critical frontier region, one that connected the empire's Syrian and Palestinian provinces to its vital holdings in Egypt. In our next segment, we will look at how this growing crisis eventually forced Rome to take the conflict seriously at the highest levels, and how the war would ultimately move toward its resolution, not through Roman military triumph, but through a negotiated peace, one whose terms would reflect just how seriously Rome had come to regard the queen it had originally underestimated. For now, let us rest again in the wide, open landscape of this campaign. Picture the pale distances of the Syrian and Palestinian desert fringe, dust rising faintly along a distant ridge where riders move and vanish. Let the steady, unhurried rhythm of that movement settle into your own breathing, slow and even, as we continue to drift gently toward sleep. Let us continue slowly as the war moves toward its turning point. By the year 377, the situation along the eastern frontier had become impossible for Rome to treat as a minor regional matter. What had begun as what Roman officials may have hoped would be a brief, containable uprising had instead settled into a prolonged and costly conflict, one that was disrupting trade routes, unsettling provincial administration, and, perhaps most troublingly for Roman commanders, demonstrating that a desert confederation under capable leadership could resist and repeatedly frustrate the military power of the empire. We do not have detailed, battle-by-battle accounts of this later phase of the war in the way a modern military historian might wish for. Ancient sources, particularly the church historians who preserved this story for us, were more interested in outcomes and their religious significance than in tactical detail. What they tell us, consistently, is that Mavia's forces continued to prove effective against the Roman troops sent to subdue them, and that this pattern persisted long enough and clearly enough that it began to affect decisions being made at the very highest levels of Roman government. It is worth remembering, too, the broader context in which Emperor Valens was operating during these same years. The Gothic crisis along the Danube frontier, which we touched on briefly in an earlier segment, was intensifying dramatically throughout 377 and into 378. Large populations of Goths, having crossed into Roman territory under difficult and poorly managed circumstances, were now in open conflict with Roman forces in the Balkans, a crisis that would eventually culminate in one of the most significant Roman military defeats in the empire's history, at a place called Adrianople. This wider context matters enormously for understanding how and why the conflict with Mavia came to an end the way it did. Valens simply could not afford to keep pouring military resources into an increasingly frustrating and inconclusive desert war, while a far larger, more dangerous crisis was unfolding along his northern frontier. Every soldier, every unit of cavalry, every experienced commander tied up fighting an elusive, mobile enemy in the deserts of Palestine and Phoenicia was a soldier, a unit, a commander unavailable for the far more urgent crisis building on the Danube. This is, in many ways, the quiet key to understanding Mavia's ultimate success. She did not need to defeat Rome in some absolute, total sense, the way later popular retellings sometimes imply when they describe her as having defeated the Roman Empire. No single regional ruler, however skilled, could realistically achieve total victory over an empire of Rome's size and resources in this period. What Mavia achieved was something more precise, and in some ways more impressive for its precision. She made the cost of continuing the war, in terms of Roman troops, resources, and attention, high enough, and the prospect of quick victory distant enough, that Rome's own strategic calculations shifted decisively toward negotiation. This is an important nuance for us to sit with, because it shapes how we should understand what defeating Rome actually meant in this context. Mavia did not march on Constantinople. She did not topple an emperor or annex Roman provinces into a new Tanukhid empire. What she did was force one of the most powerful states in the ancient world to recognize that it could not simply impose its will on her confederation by military force alone, and to negotiate with her as a genuine equal on terms that reflected her strength rather than Rome's usual posture of granting favor from a position of unquestioned dominance. According to the ancient sources, negotiations began sometime around 378 AD, initiated, notably, from the Roman side. This detail alone tells us a great deal. Rome, accustomed to dictating the terms of its relationships with frontier allies, was instead approaching Mavia to request peace, a reversal of the usual dynamic that would not have gone unnoticed by observers on either side of the frontier. The terms of the peace that emerged from these negotiations were significant, and they reflected the genuine strength of Mavia's negotiating position. First, and most directly connected to the original cause of the conflict, Rome agreed to consecrate Moses, the ascetic hermit Mavia had originally requested, as bishop for her people, rather than imposing an Arian appointee as Valens's religious policy would otherwise have dictated. This was, in a very real sense, Mavia winning the specific dispute that had first pushed the relationship into open war. An emperor who had spent years promoting Arian church leadership throughout his realm made an exception for her on this frontier. Second, and just as significantly, the broader terms of alliance between Rome and the Tanukhid confederation appear to have been renegotiated on terms considerably more favorable to Mavia than the arrangement that had existed before the war. While the precise details of this renewed alliance are not fully preserved for us in the surviving sources, the general pattern described by ancient historians suggests a relationship restored on terms that better respected Tanukhid autonomy, and crucially, one that would soon see Tanukhid forces once again fighting alongside Rome. But now as genuinely valued allies rather than as a frontier population whose grievances had been allowed to fester unaddressed. There is something worth sitting with here. In this moment of resolution, Mavia had every opportunity at this point in the conflict to continue pressing her advantage, to extract even more from a Roman administration that was clearly eager to conclude the war on almost any reasonable terms, so that it could redirect its full attention toward the Gothic crisis. Instead, she appears to have negotiated a settlement that secured her core objectives: the bishop, the renewed and more favorable alliance, without pushing toward the kind of total, destabilizing victory that might have left the frontier in chaos, or that might have provoked a much larger, more determined Roman response once the Gothic crisis had eventually been resolved. This suggests a ruler thinking not only about the immediate war, but about the longer-term stability and prosperity of her people, who depended, in the end, on continued access to the trade routes and markets that only a functioning relationship with Rome could reliably provide. A desert confederation, however militarily capable, could not sustain itself indefinitely through raiding and conflict alone. Peace, on the right terms, served Mavia's people just as effectively as war had, and arguably more so, in the years that would follow. In our next segment, we will look at what came after this peace, including a remarkable and often overlooked detail of Mavia's story: the marriage of her daughter to a prominent Roman military commander, and the presence of Tanukhid troops fighting alongside Roman forces at one of the most consequential battles in all of Roman history. For now, let us simply rest in this moment of resolution. Picture a desert queen, having achieved what few frontier rulers of her era ever managed, choosing restraint over further conquest, securing peace on her own terms rather than chasing an unattainable total victory. Let this image of quiet, deliberate strength settle over you as your own breathing continues to slow, carrying you gently further toward rest. Let us continue on gently into the years that followed the peace. One of the more striking details preserved in the ancient accounts of Mavia's story concerns the marriage of her daughter. According to the historian Socrates Scholasticus, Mavia's daughter was given in marriage to a Roman military commander named Victor, a man who held a significant position within the Roman army of the period. This marriage was almost certainly a diplomatic arrangement, part of the broader web of alliance building that so often followed periods of conflict in the ancient world, where marriages between ruling families served to bind former adversaries together through kinship, in ways that treaties on parchment alone could not always guarantee. This detail deserves a moment of quiet reflection, because it tells us something important about how Mavia approached the aftermath of her war with Rome. she had proven decisively that her confederation could not simply be dismissed or dominated by Roman military force. And yet, rather than maintaining a posture of permanent hostility or suspicion toward Rome, she appears to have pursued a strategy of genuine, functional reconciliation, one that included the kind of personal, familial bonds that ancient rulers so often used to cement lasting peace between formerly warring powers. We know very little about Mavia's daughter herself, not even her name, which is a familiar and frustrating pattern throughout this entire story, one we have encountered again and again. Even the daughter of a queen who had defied and defeated Roman military forces was not considered significant enough in the eyes of the male historians recording these events to be named in the surviving record. We are left, once again, to read around the edges of the silence, inferring meaning from the shape of what was left out as much as from what was included. What we can say, with reasonable confidence, is that this marriage placed a member of Mavia's own family at the heart of the Roman military establishment, and it set the stage for one of the most poignant and consequential details of this entire story: the presence of Tanukhid troops fighting alongside Roman forces at the Battle of Adrianople in the year 378 AD. Adrianople was, without question, one of the most significant military engagements in the entire history of the late Roman Empire. It took place in what is now northwestern Turkey, near the modern city of Edirne, and it pitted the Eastern Roman army, led personally by Emperor Valens, against a large coalition of Gothic forces, who had, as we discussed earlier, been driven into Roman territory under pressure from the westward migration of the Huns, and who had subsequently been mistreated and mismanaged by Roman provincial authorities in ways that pushed them into open rebellion. The battle itself, which unfolded on a hot August day, ended in catastrophe for Rome. The Eastern Roman field army was decisively defeated, and Emperor Valens himself was killed in the fighting, his body never conclusively identified afterward among the dead. It stands, even today, as one of the most significant military disasters in Roman history, and many historians mark it as an important early moment in the long, slow process that would eventually lead to the transformation. And in the western half of the empire, the eventual dissolution of Roman imperial power. And within the ranks of the Roman forces at this catastrophic battle, according to the ancient sources, were troops supplied by the Tanukhid confederation, sent as part of the renewed alliance that had emerged from the peace negotiated with Mavia only a short time before. There is something remarkably poignant in this detail, something worth sitting with slowly and without rushing past it. Here was a queen who had, only recently, led her people in a successful war against Roman authority, defying and defeating Roman military efforts to subdue her. And yet, when the renewed alliance called for it, her people fought and died alongside the very Roman forces they had so recently opposed in one of the empire's darkest military hours. This detail complicates any simple, triumphant narrative of Mavia as purely an enemy of Rome, a desert conqueror who humbled the empire and then walked away. The reality, as it so often is in history, was far more complicated and in some ways far more interesting. Mavia's relationship with Rome was not a simple story of hostility resolved into permanent separation. It was a relationship renegotiated on more equal and more respectful terms, one that ultimately reintegrated her confederation into the broader Roman alliance system, but as a partner whose autonomy and religious preferences had been genuinely acknowledged, rather than as a subordinate population expected to simply comply with whatever Rome decided. We do not know precisely how Mavia herself felt about sending her people's soldiers to fight and die for the same empire she had so recently opposed in war. No source records her personal reaction to the disaster at Adrianople, or to whatever losses her own Tanukhid contingents may have suffered there. This is, again, one of the many silences in her story. Silences we must learn to sit with rather than fill in with invented certainty. What we can say is that the alliance held even through this catastrophe, suggesting that whatever terms Mavia had negotiated and whatever trust had been rebuilt between her confederation and Rome proved durable enough to survive one of the most difficult military crises the Eastern Empire would face in this entire century. In the years immediately following Adrianople, the Eastern Roman Empire found itself in a period of considerable vulnerability. Its field army badly depleted, its new emperor, Theodosius, inheriting a genuinely precarious situation. The continued loyalty and military support of allied groups like the Tanukhid Confederation would have mattered a great deal during this fragile period. As Rome worked to rebuild its military strength and stabilize its eastern frontier once again, it is worth noting, too, how this episode reflects back on Mavia's original decision to go to war in the first place. She had not sought the total destruction of Roman power, nor a permanent state of hostility between her people and the empire. She had sought respect, religious autonomy for her community, and a fair and honestly maintained alliance. Once those things had been secured, she appears to have been genuinely willing to resume a cooperative relationship with Rome, even one that asked significant sacrifice of her own people in Rome's continued time of need. In our next segment, we will step back from the battlefield entirely and spend some time in the quieter world of everyday Tanukhid and Arab frontier life during this period. The world of tents and trade routes, of desert monasteries and oasis towns that formed the backdrop against which all of these dramatic political and military events unfolded. For now, let us rest in this image of complicated, imperfect reconciliation, a queen who fought for her people's dignity, and who, once that dignity had been secured, chose partnership over permanent enmity, even when that partnership demanded real sacrifice. Let this quiet complexity settle over you gently, without urgency, as your breathing continues to slow and deepen. Let us step back now, gently, from the battles and treaties, and spend some time simply in the world Mavia's people inhabited day to day. It can be easy, when following a story built around war and diplomacy, to lose sight of the ordinary rhythms of life that continued underneath all of it. For most members of the Tanukhid confederation, the Queen's war with Rome, however consequential, was only one part of a life that was still governed, first and foremost, by the older, steadier rhythms of the desert itself. The movement of herds, the search for water, the weaving of tents, the raising of children, the telling of stories around an evening fire. Let us spend this segment there, in that quieter world, before we return to the larger sweep of history. Home for most Tanukhid families was not a fixed building, but a tent, woven from dark goat hair into long panels that could be joined together, raised on wooden poles, and taken down again within an hour or two when it was time to move on. These tents were remarkably effective shelters, dense enough to keep out rain during the rare desert storms, yet able to be adjusted along their sides to allow cooling air to pass through during the long, hot months. Inside, the space was often divided, sometimes by a woven curtain, into an area for the women and children of the family, and an area where guests could be received, following long-established customs of desert hospitality that placed enormous value on welcoming travelers, regardless of their tribal origin, with food, water, and protection, for as long as they remained under that particular family's care. This custom of hospitality was not merely a pleasant social nicety. In a landscape where the difference between finding water and not finding it could be a matter of life or death, the tradition of offering shelter and provision to travelers functioned as a kind of vital, distributed safety network across the whole desert region, one that every family depended upon at different points in their own seasonal travels, and one that every family was, in turn, expected to uphold for others. Water itself deserves particular attention here, because it shaped nearly every aspect of Tanukhid life, and, as we discussed earlier, would go on to shape the very course of the war with Rome. Wells across this region were often ancient, some dug and maintained across many generations, their locations passed down through careful oral tradition long before any map could have recorded them with precision. Certain wells were associated with particular clans or confederations who held informal but well understood rights to their use, rights that were carefully respected by other groups moving through the same territory, since violating another clan's water rights could easily spark serious and lasting conflict. Alongside the herding of camels, sheep, and goats, trade formed the other great pillar of Tanukhid economic life. The caravan routes that passed through their territory carried an extraordinary range of goods across enormous distances. From the far south of the Arabian Peninsula came frankincense and myrrh, aromatic resins harvested from trees that grew in only a few specific regions of the world, prized throughout the Roman Empire for use in religious rituals, in medicine, and in perfume, and valuable enough that a well-guarded caravan carrying these goods represented a small fortune moving slowly across the desert. From further east, having already crossed an almost unimaginable distance, came silk, carried along trade networks that stretched, link by link, caravan by caravan, all the way back to China. Though no single merchant in this chain likely traveled the entire route themselves. Spices from India, arriving by sea at ports along the Red Sea coast, were carried northward by camel caravan before eventually reaching Roman markets around the Mediterranean. Precious stones, dyes, textiles, all of it moved through this vast network, and tribes like the Tanukhids, who controlled key stretches of the routes these goods traveled, earned income through tolls, through providing protection and guidance to merchant caravans, and through direct participation in trade themselves. This trading relationship gave the Tanukhid confederation a level of wealth and sophistication that might surprise those who imagine desert tribal life as simple or impoverished. Archaeological evidence from this broader region and period reveals evidence of fine metalwork, imported glassware, and other luxury goods circulating among Arab tribal elites, alongside the more practical tools and objects of everyday pastoral life. Mavia herself, as queen of a confederation with this level of economic engagement, would have overseen not merely a collection of wandering herders, but a genuinely sophisticated political and economic entity, one with real diplomatic and commercial relationships extending in multiple directions, toward Rome in the north and west, and toward the deeper Arabian interior and the Red Sea trade networks to the south. Religious life, too, was undergoing significant change during this period. Change that, as we saw in earlier segments, played directly into the causes of Mavia's war. Christianity had been spreading gradually among Arab tribal populations along the Roman frontier for generations by this point, carried through trade contact, through intermarriage with Christian communities in Roman-controlled towns, and through the quiet, patient work of monks and hermits who established small communities and hermitages in the desert itself. Some of them, like Moses, gaining considerable reputations for holiness that crossed easily between the Roman and Arab worlds. These desert holy men occupied a fascinating and important position within this frontier society, living lives of extreme simplicity, often in caves or simple stone shelters far from any settled town. They nonetheless became figures of significant spiritual authority, respected by Roman Christians, and increasingly by Arab Christian communities alike. Moses himself, before his elevation to bishop through Mavia's insistence, would have been exactly this kind of figure, a hermit whose reputation for piety had spread widely enough that a queen negotiating peace with an empire chose specifically to insist on his appointment, rather than accepting whichever bishop Roman religious authorities might otherwise have selected. It is worth remembering, too, that not all of Tanukhid religious life had converted to Christianity by this period. Older traditions, tied to the worship of various regional deities associated with the sun, the moon, and particular sacred sites, continued to hold significance for some communities and individuals, even as Christianity spread more broadly across the region. Mavia's confederation, like so many societies undergoing religious transition, likely contained this full range of belief and practice within it, existing alongside one another rather than replacing each other in some clean, immediate way. As we sit with this fuller picture of Tanukhid life, the tents and the wells, the caravans and the desert hermits, the older gods slowly giving way to newer devotion, we begin to see Mavia's war with Rome not as an isolated political event, but as one moment within a much larger, slower story of a people navigating change, protecting what mattered most to them: their water, their trade, their spiritual autonomy, their basic dignity as a distinct people, against the pressures and demands of a much larger neighboring power. In our next segment, we will look at how Mavia's story, despite everything she achieved, gradually faded from historical memory in the centuries that followed. And we will consider some of the reasons why a queen who had accomplished so much came to be so thoroughly forgotten by later generations. For now, let us simply rest a while longer in this quieter world. The soft sound of camel bells in the cooling evening air, firelight flickering against dark woven tent walls, the low murmur of voices sharing stories that had been told in one form or another for generations before this one. Let this steady, ancient rhythm carry you further into rest. Let us continue, drifting now toward the quieter, sadder question of how a ruler as accomplished as Mavia came to be so thoroughly forgotten. It is worth sitting with this question for a while, because the answer tells us as much about the nature of historical memory itself as it does about Mavia specifically. Remarkable achievements do not automatically guarantee remembrance. What survives in the historical record and what fades away depends enormously on who is doing the recording, what they consider important, and which stories continue to be retold, copied, and preserved across the centuries that follow. The first, and perhaps most significant factor in Mavia's gradual disappearance from historical memory lies in the nature of the sources that recorded her story in the first place. As we have mentioned throughout this journey, everything we know about Mavia comes to us through Roman and Greek Christian historians, writing from within the very empire she had opposed. Chief among these are Socrates, Scholasticus, and Sozomen, both of whom wrote substantial ecclesiastical histories in the 5th century, several decades after Mavia's own lifetime, and Rufinus, who wrote somewhat earlier, closer to the events themselves. These writers, however, were not primarily interested in Mavia as a historical or political figure in her own right. Their central concern, as their titles suggest, was church history, the story of Christianity's spread, its internal theological disputes, and its relationship with the institutions of empire. Mavia appears in their accounts largely because her story intersects with a matter of church politics that mattered deeply to them: the appointment of an Orthodox, Nicene bishop, Moses, in defiance of an Arian emperor's preferences. Her military campaign against Rome, however remarkable, was recorded primarily as context for this religious episode, rather than as the central subject worthy of its own sustained, detailed historical treatment. This meant that Mavia's story was preserved, but preserved narrowly, filtered through a lens that cared more about the religious outcome than about her as a political and military leader. We have no detailed account of her individual battles, no description of her personal characteristics beyond the barest suggestions of capability and determination, no record of her own words or her own perspective on any of the events we have discussed across this documentary. She survives in history as a supporting detail within someone else's story, rather than as the central subject of her own. This pattern, unfortunately, was extraordinarily common for women in positions of significant historical power throughout the ancient and medieval worlds, and it deserves a moment of honest reflection. Ancient historical writing was overwhelmingly produced by men, for audiences primarily interested in the affairs of men, particularly the affairs of emperors, generals, and church leaders. Women who wielded real power, even remarkable power, as Mavia clearly did, were recorded when their actions intersected directly with matters those male historians already considered significant and were otherwise left in silence. We have already noted several times throughout this documentary how many basic details of Mavia's life were simply never written down at all. Her birth, her early life, her personal characteristics, even the name of her own daughter. Beyond the limitations of the original sources themselves, there is a second factor worth considering: the simple mechanics of how historical memory survives across centuries. Stories that get retold, copied into later manuscripts, referenced by later historians, translated into new languages, and incorporated into the broader cultural narrative of a civilization, tend to survive and grow more prominent over time. Stories that remain confined to a narrow religious chronicle, interesting primarily to specialists in church history, tend to fade into increasing obscurity, known only to a small number of dedicated scholars, even when the underlying events were, in their own time, genuinely significant. Mavia's story falls firmly into this second category. It was never adopted into the broader tradition of celebrated Roman military history, the way stories of Rome's great victories, or even some of its most notable defeats, were preserved and retold across the centuries in works of literature, art, and popular memory. It did not become part of later Arab historical or literary tradition in the way that later, more mythologized Arab warrior figures sometimes did, in part because the written Arabic historical tradition, as it developed in the centuries following the rise of Islam, tended to focus its attention on different regions, different genealogies, and different foundational narratives than the specific 4th century Christian Tanukhid confederation that Mavia had led. There is also a simpler, more structural reason for her fading from memory. The Tanukhid confederation itself did not endure as a distinct, prominent political entity for many more generations after Mavia's lifetime. Over the following centuries, the political landscape of the Arabian frontier continued to shift, as it always had. Other tribal confederations rose to prominence in different periods, absorbing or overshadowing groups like the Tanukhids. The Eastern Roman Empire itself, which we now often call the Byzantine Empire, underwent its own centuries of transformation. And then, in the 7th century, the rise of Islam and the subsequent Arab conquests reshaped the entire political and religious landscape of the region so dramatically that the world Mavia had lived in, a world of Christian Arab foederati negotiating carefully with a still pagan-influenced late Roman Empire, became, in a real sense, a closed and distant chapter, overshadowed by the much larger historical transformations that followed it. When there is no continuous political entity, no enduring dynasty, no persistent institution carrying a ruler's memory forward generation after generation, and when the original written sources treat that ruler as a secondary detail within someone else's story, the conditions for genuine historical forgetting are almost perfectly assembled. This is, in a quiet and somewhat melancholy way, exactly what happened to Mavia, and yet she was never entirely lost. The manuscripts containing the accounts of Socrates, Scholasticus, Sozomen, and Rufinus survived, copied and recopied by scribes across the centuries, preserved within the broader manuscript tradition of Christian ecclesiastical history, valued for their religious content, even as the specific details about Mavia within them received relatively little independent attention. It was really only in more recent centuries, as modern historians began to study late antiquity with fresh eyes, looking specifically for the kinds of overlooked figures and stories that earlier scholarship had passed by too quickly, that Mavia's story began to receive the kind of dedicated attention it deserves. Modern historians of late antique Arabia, of Roman frontier relations, and of women's history in the ancient world have, in recent decades, worked carefully to reconstruct and highlight her story from these fragmentary ancient sources, recognizing in her a genuinely significant figure whose accomplishments had simply never received proportionate attention. In our next segment, we will look at what became of the Tanukhid Confederation and the wider Arab Christian frontier world in the years and decades following Mavia's reign. And we will begin to bring this long, quiet story toward its close. For now, let us rest in this reflection on memory and forgetting. Think, if you like, of all the quiet, capable people throughout history whose stories were never fully recorded, whose achievements were folded into the margins of someone else's narrative, and yet who shaped the world around them all the same, whether or not later generations remembered their names. Let this thought settle gently, without sadness, simply as part of the fuller, more honest picture of how history actually works. As your breathing continues its slow, steady rhythm toward rest, let us continue gently onward, following the story into its later, quieter chapters. We do not know precisely when Mavia's own life came to an end, or how many more years she continued to lead her confederation after the peace of 378 and the subsequent battle of Adrianople. The ancient sources, having recorded the dramatic episode of her war and its resolution, largely fall silent on the later years of her reign. In keeping with the pattern we have already discussed, in which her story was preserved only in fragments connected to matters of church history, rather than as a continuous, complete biography. What we can trace, with somewhat more confidence, is the broader trajectory of the Tanukhid confederation and the Arab Christian frontier world in the decades that followed her reign. The alliance that Mavia had renegotiated with Rome appears to have persisted for some time, with Tanukhid forces continuing to serve as valued Roman allies along the eastern frontier through the final decades of the 4th century and into the early 5th. This was, in many ways, exactly the outcome Mavia herself seems to have worked toward. Not permanent separation from Rome, but a relationship rebuilt on terms that respected her people's autonomy and dignity. Over time, however, the specific prominence of the Tanukhid confederation within this frontier system gradually gave way to other Arab tribal groups who rose to take on the role of Rome's principal Arab federate allies in different periods. By the 5th and 6th centuries, other confederations, most notably the Ghassanids, had become the dominant Arab Christian ally of the Eastern Roman, or Byzantine, empire along this same general frontier region, inheriting, in many ways, the same basic role that the Tanukhids had once played in Mavia's time. This kind of gradual shift in prominence among frontier tribal confederations was a common and recurring pattern throughout the long history of the Roman and Byzantine relationship with Arab peoples, reflecting the ongoing, ever-shifting balance of power, population, and leadership among the many tribal groups who inhabited this vast frontier region across the centuries. The Arab Christian communities that had developed along this frontier, including those descended from or connected to the Tanukhid confederation, continued to exist and, in many cases, to flourish for centuries afterward. monasteries, and hermitages, like the tradition that Moses himself had belonged to, continued to be established throughout the region, becoming important centers of religious learning, manuscript preservation, and spiritual life that would persist for a very long time. Some of them, remarkably, continuing in some form for many centuries after Mavia's own lifetime. The larger world around this frontier, however, was moving toward transformations of an entirely different scale. The Eastern Roman Empire itself would continue for many more centuries, evolving gradually into what modern historians call the Byzantine Empire, a Greek-speaking Christian empire centered on Constantinople that would persist, with periods of great strength and periods of severe difficulty, until its eventual fall in 1453. Along its eastern and southern frontiers, the relationship with Arab tribal populations would continue to evolve, shaped by new religious movements, new political pressures, and new waves of migration and change. Then, in the early 7th century, a transformation began that would reshape the entire region far more dramatically than anything that had come before. The rise of Islam, beginning in the Arabian Peninsula under the Prophet Muhammad, and the subsequent rapid expansion of Arab Muslim armies throughout the 630s and beyond, fundamentally altered the political and religious landscape of the entire Near East. Within just a few decades, vast territories that had been part of the Byzantine and Sasanian Persian empires for centuries came under new Arab Muslim rule, including the very regions Syria, Palestine, and the broader frontier lands where Mavia's story had unfolded some 250 years earlier. This transformation, so much larger and more consequential than anything the 4th century frontier world had experienced, effectively closed the particular historical chapter that Mavia's story belonged to, the specific political arrangement she had negotiated, a Christian Arab tribal confederation serving as a semi-autonomous ally of a still partially pagan-influenced Roman Empire, was a product of a very particular moment in history, one that simply no longer existed in the same form once the entire region's religious and political character had been so thoroughly reshaped by the rise of Islam. It is worth noting, gently, that this does not mean the Arab Christian communities of this region simply vanished. Arab Christian populations continued to exist throughout the region for centuries following the rise of Islam. And indeed, Arab Christian communities persist in parts of the Middle East to this very day, carrying forward in various forms threads of a religious and cultural tradition that reaches back to exactly this period we have been exploring throughout this documentary. But the specific political world of 4th century Roman-Arab frontier relations, the world of feuderati agreements and desert queens negotiating directly with Roman emperors, belonged distinctly to its own moment, a moment that closed gradually but decisively, in the centuries that followed Mavia's own lifetime. Looking back across this whole arc, from Mavia's rise to power as a young widow, through the causes and course of her war with Rome, through the peace she negotiated and the complicated alliance that followed, and finally, through the slow fading of her story into historical obscurity, what emerges is a portrait of a ruler whose accomplishments were genuinely remarkable by any reasonable historical standard, and whose relative obscurity says far more about the biases and limitations of historical record-keeping than it does about the significance of what she actually achieved. She led a successful military campaign against one of the most powerful states the ancient world ever produced. She secured genuine religious autonomy for her people at a time when the reigning emperor was actively suppressing that same religious position throughout the rest of his empire. She negotiated a peace that reflected her own strength rather than accepting terms dictated by Rome. And she did so with enough wisdom and restraint to preserve a durable, functional relationship with her former adversary, one strong enough to survive even the trauma of the Roman defeat at Adrianople. By almost any measure we might reasonably apply, this is the record of an exceptionally capable and successful ruler. In our final segment, we will draw this long, quiet journey to a gentle close, reflecting on what Mavia's story might mean to us now, so many centuries later, and easing fully into rest. For now, let us simply hold this fuller picture together for a moment. A desert confederation, its prominence gradually passing to others, as confederations always eventually do. A wider frontier world, transformed beyond recognition by forces far larger than any single ruler could have anticipated. And at the center of it, still, if we look closely enough through the gaps in the old records, a queen who met an empire in open conflict and did not lose. Let us come, now gently, to the close of tonight's journey. We have traveled a long way together this evening, from the wide, wind-swept frontier of the 4th century Roman East, through the quiet rise of a widow into a queen, through the causes of a war few expected her to win, through the campaigns themselves, fought not through overwhelming force, but through patience, knowledge of the land, and capable leadership. We have sat with the peace she negotiated, the complicated alliance that followed, the battlefield at Adrianople, where her people's loyalty was tested in the hardest possible way, and the slow, quiet centuries afterward, in which her extraordinary story gradually faded from memory, preserved only in the margins of someone else's history. It is worth asking, as we bring this particular story to its rest, what a life and a reign so distant from our own, separated from us by more than 1,600 years, might still have to offer us tonight. Perhaps it is simply this: that real strength, historically speaking, so rarely looks like the version of it we are used to seeing in more dramatic, more mythologized stories. Mavia did not need to be larger than life to accomplish what she accomplished. She needed to understand her own land better than her adversary did. She needed to hold together a coalition of people with competing interests and genuine grievances. She needed to know when to fight, and just as importantly, when a negotiated peace would serve her people better than continued conflict, however tempting further victory might have been. She needed, in her later years, to maintain a difficult, imperfect, but ultimately durable relationship with a former enemy, because she understood that her people's long-term well-being depended on stability and trade and continued access to a wider world, not on prolonged hostility for its own sake. These are not the qualities that always make for the most dramatic retelling. There is no single decisive battle we can point to as the moment everything changed. No dramatic personal confrontation between Mavia and a Roman emperor that later artists could paint or later poets could immortalize in verse. What we have instead is something quieter and in its own way more impressive. A sustained record of capable, patient leadership, exercised over years, under real pressure, with real consequences for the people who depended on her. It is worth remembering, too, just how much of her story we simply do not have. We do not know her voice. We do not know how she felt in the moments before her first campaign, whether she felt certainty or doubt, or some difficult mixture of both. We do not know what she said to her assembled clans when she asked them to follow her into a war against the most powerful state in their known world. We do not know her private thoughts on the peace she eventually negotiated, or on the difficult, complicated years of renewed alliance that followed. We do not even know her daughter's name, or how many other children she may have had, or what her own final years and eventual death were like. All of this has been filtered away by the accidents of history, by the particular interests of the writers who happened to record fragments of her story, by the simple passage of so many centuries, during which so much of the past is inevitably worn away. The way wind slowly smooths the edges of stone in the very desert she called home. And yet enough remains, enough survives in the careful, patient work of historians who have pieced her story back together from these scattered fragments, for us to know that she existed, that she led, that she fought, and that she won in the fullest, most meaningful sense that a frontier ruler of her time and place could reasonably have hoped to win. She secured dignity and autonomy for her people. She proved decisively that the desert was not simply Rome's to command. And she did all of this as a woman, in a world that offered very few women any real path toward this kind of authority. In a position she did not inherit through simple formality, but earned through demonstrated capability, through the trust of the people who chose, again and again, to follow her. Perhaps that is enough of a story to carry with us tonight, as we finally let go of the day behind us. Somewhere in the deep past, in a wide desert now folded into the modern nations of Jordan, Syria, and the surrounding region, a queen who very nearly slipped entirely out of memory once stood at the head of her people and chose, when the moment demanded it, to stand her ground. We will likely never know exactly where she is buried, or precisely how her own life came to its end. The desert keeps some of its secrets more carefully than any archive ever could. But in the quiet persistence of her story, surviving against the odds through 17 centuries of silence and forgetting, there is something worth resting with tonight. A reminder that history is far fuller, far more complicated, and far more populated by remarkable, ordinary people than the handful of famous names we tend to remember most easily. If you have made it this far, thank you for spending this quiet evening with Queen Mavia and with me. If this kind of slow, gentle journey through forgotten history is something that helps you rest, please consider subscribing so that future stories like this one can find their way to you on some other tired night when you need somewhere quiet to let your thoughts finally settle. There are many more forgotten corners of history still waiting for us to wander through together, slowly, one quiet story at a time. For now, let the desert fall silent. Let the fires along that ancient frontier burn low and finally go out. Let the last image you carry with you be simply this: wide, open country beneath an enormous field of stars, utterly still, utterly at peace, exactly as it has been resting quietly for longer than any empire, any queen, or any one of us could ever fully measure. Rest well,